So thank you for the introduction. I'm hoping I can be a resource for you today and in the future. As Evan said, I'm with the Partnership for Children and Youth. We're a statewide nonprofit. We focus on advocacy and capacity building, working to ensure that children and youth in the most under-resourced communities in the state have access to quality expanded learning opportunities. And the term expanded learning is quite the hot buzz term right now, but inclusive of, after school, summer programs, and other youth-centered and development programs in the community. We house the California Afterschool Advocacy Alliance. It's a mouthful, so we say CA3. Yes, and we have several members that you guys are all, the state alliances of Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs are members, along with many other after school and summer providers and child advocacy organizations around the state. And we, have a big group of supporters from family, law enforcement, educators, and a whole bunch of others who've been helpful along the way to raise the voice for after school and summer funding. Goals for today, want to share with you some opportunities for funding that are available now or soon to be. Wanted to share what we are seeing and hearing statewide in terms of creative uses for these resources, and also how community partners are advocating. What are their strategies? Who are they reaching out to? What's the timing? That sort of thing. Also want to share a little bit about our statewide policy and advocacy efforts to provide more support to programs and the communities that they serve. I'm not going to give you a long history about after school advocacy in California, but just wanted to highlight a few pieces that may be helpful context for your local conversations. State funding for after school programs started back when after school leaders in San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles started asking state leaders back in 1999 for an investment, and it started with $50 million. And then when Arnold Schwarzenegger put Proposition 49 on the ballot, that was the real explosion of funding, and that brought in $550 million for state-funded programs specifically for students K through 8th or 9th grade. And we also have federal funding through the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. And with those two funding streams, California has really built the largest and best rated expanded learning system in the country. Yet, this system has been underfunded even before the pandemic began. The CA3 came together in 2009 to start talking about ways in which we could increase quality and access to these publicly funded programs. And like Evan said, we ran some multi-year campaign efforts to bringing in a whole lot of diverse stakeholders to call for more funding for these programs. And we are starting, it's been a slow climb to get decision makers to understand the role and impact of expanded learning programs. And it's also taken a lot of time to reach out to so many of the after school professionals and community partners who are doing this work and letting them know about ways in which they can bring more support to their programs and community. The last thing I just want to say is that while we do have this funding for ACES and 21st Century ongoing, the funding that they provide, it's less than about $3 per hour per kid. And yes, we pull in local resources and LEA matches and that sort of thing, but funding is still at a very low rate, and we've got a whole lot of initiatives that we're working on to bring in more funding. But turning to the funding sources that are available right now, PCY and the California Afterschool Network created this funding chart that outlines kind of like our best recommendations on funding that's available from the federal or state level. This is just like a screenshot of it, but the link can get you access to this document, and we are updating it as more information and funding streams become available. Today, I'm just going to focus on AB 86. This is the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant. This is the state funding that came out early this spring. And then also talking about the American Rescue Plan and specifically the ESSER funding that is going, that the state has some control over, and then what is going to districts. So altogether, the funding stream, it's more than $30 billion that can support expanded learning opportunities. So getting into the state funding that has already been settled, there was a huge push, right, to reopen schools and to provide expanded learning opportunities, and there's a broad use of what that means. And we really want to focus on the $4.6 billion in the red box that is going out on the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant, and not so much on the in-person instruction grants. With the $4.6 billion, this funding is dedicated to provide supplemental instruction and support for disadvantaged student groups who've faced adverse learning and social emotional circumstances as a result of the pandemic. This funding is going out to LEAs, meaning school districts, county offices, and some charters. And this funding is being distributed by formula. And it's based on, as other funding has gone, it's based on Title I eligibility for school districts. And there's a link that you can look it up, the apportionment by school district, to know what's coming down. Districts have a very short turnaround to decide how they want to use this funding. They need to publicly, like in a public meeting, they need to pass a plan to expend these funds, and they need to use these funds by the end of August 2022. And LEAs are expecting to receive some of this funding now and in August. So there's a whole lot of conversations going on right now. I'm sure you guys have seen some discussion at school board, and perhaps in conversation later, it's the question of, well, how do we get the school districts to let us into the table and talk about the use of funding? But these are just the basics. Yes, stakeholder input is required. They need to engage families, teachers, and other school staff, and specifically encourage LEAs to engage with community partners and expanded learning programs on how to do this. This funding this supplemental instruction and support is especially for these student subgroups, but LEAs can also define other student groups that may be prioritized locally. So in some cases, right, this has been similar to what has happened with previous funding of, like, if there are other groups that need to be included, please, that they have flexibility to do so. They can also serve students in addition to this, but this is the primary target for these funds. After school and summer programs are one of 7 broad options under the integrated student supports community learning hubs are also called out here for folks who've been involved in those, running those, leading those throughout the pandemic. But again, whole lot of latitude about how these funds could be used. And CDE just released an FAQ because they've been receiving some questions, and happy to answer some of those questions if you have them later on as well. Okay, that's the state funding rundown quickly. Moving on to federal funding. The American Rescue Plan has a whole lot of money for a whole lot of people, but we're really focused, at least in this part, is on the ESSER 3 funding that's going out for schools. I also have some information I'll give shortly around money going to counties and cities, but just starting with education, CA3 has been very active in trying to recommend uses for the state set-asides, that 10% of this funding that has funding specifically designated for after school and summer and learning loss recovery interventions. And so that's happening at the state process. We're working on that. It is likely to go through the budget process, which is happening right now. The governor will release an updated budget proposal this week. So there's a lot of conversation about what the state could do to leverage that funding in support of existing programs, and especially community partners who have not been eligible for funding. You know, most of this funding has gone out through LEAs so far. The piece that I wanted to zero in on, again in the red circle, is the 20% of the funding that is going directly to LEAs. This is a minimum 20%. They can spend more than 20% on evidence-based learning loss recovery interventions that, of course, include after school and summer learning as well. This funding will go out through LEAs again, but we only have estimates on what school districts will receive or what LEAs may receive. Again, state's still working on trying to figure this out. The state has to submit a plan to the federal government by December 7th on how to use this funding. And they need to involve stakeholders in how they set the state's plan for this. But once it gets into the districts, we don't have a lot of information about what will be asked of districts and how to use this funding, what kind of stakeholder input will be required, what are the accountability and transparency measures. All of that stuff still needs to be decided. And of course, we have a lot of recommendations on how they could do that. Districts will have a lot of flexibility on this. Again, understanding local need, but wanted to highlight that at least with the 20% and so much of this funding, it's not supposed to be just for remediation. It is not the drill and skill old school summer programs that I think of. We're talking about providing support for the social and emotional and physical needs of students so that they can, start to re-engage and reconnect and rebuild those relationships at school, and then prepare to accelerate learning. Really want to just underline the fact that if LEAs have a very narrow focus, it does not meet the letter of the law around the intent of this funding. Again, we expect student populations to be prioritized based on, who's been most impacted during the pandemic, but still waiting for more clarification that we expect to have just in a matter of weeks from the state on how this funding can go out. Turning to counties and city funding, this is some information that I was able to share from Funding the Next Generation. They had a previous webinar where they were talking about that. I am not the expert on city and county funding, but wanted to give you this link so that you can also understand, what funding is coming to cities and counties and how that may be used, and found it was very interesting that, if it's to address public health and economic impacts of the pandemic, I think a lot of expanded learning programs, and certainly if you ask families, would agree that a number of your programs and supports could fall into this category. Moving on.
Oh, really quick, Jen, there's a question in the chat just about whether or not there's funding available for nonprofits with after school programming for the previous, not the city, but the state level funding. And we were wondering if you could address that, because it sounded like it was more focused on schools applying districts.
Sorry, I missed part of your question. Do you mind repeating it? Sorry.
Yeah, there was a question, just is any of this funding available for nonprofits with after school programming?
So the funding that either for the state or the federal funding we expect it to be able to subcontract to community partners through LEAs. However, CA3, we expect to be asking for some of this funding to go directly to community-based organizations, nonprofits. We are working on the language right now, and have had conversations that seem to understand, at least in the capital, that nonprofits have been left out a lot of the previous funding, and there's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of effort in coordinating with LEAs to get this funding through them. And so we are trying to find alternative ways to get this funding to folks as efficiently and equitably as possible. So at this point, no direct funding to nonprofits through the education streams, but that is what we are asking for.
And hey guys, I'll just chime in on the questions. We're gonna have Q&A at the end. So we see all the great questions in chat, just hold on to them. We know everybody's trying to figure it out, so we'll let Jen finish.
Thank you. Going quickly through these, no matter what funding stream you are applying for, we're trying to highlight some of the best practices and suggestions that we're seeing, and hope they can help you in your local advocacy. We talk a lot about educating and informing. Educating and informing decision makers and stakeholders. And decision makers are overwhelmed, as we all are. But there's a whole lot of information and funding coming quickly, and thinking about how many of us have been talking about these changes that we would like to see in investments in our community and in our schools, but that has always been a barrier of not enough funding. But now we have the funding, so there's kind of this opportunity to be very creative, but there is not much time to get these creative plans organized. And so decision makers just really need a lot of help sorting through, what is needed urgently, what is going to be needed long term. We're talking about multiple years, and making sure that these investments, even if it is one-time funding, can be leveraged with braided funding and support for a more sustainable system of supports for students and families. We've been reaching out to expanded learning providers and trying to highlight that, they really are the experts in helping raise the voice of what students and families have needed during the pandemic and what they are needing now, and to recover and rebuild. You have firsthand knowledge of what it's going to take, and you don't need to be an expert about the particular funding stream or regulation. Just wanted to empower you all as critical voices that need to be at the table. we recommend folks bring as much data and stories as they can to these conversations if they can't bring actual partners with them. So we've seen some students and families and principals come in with community partners to explain how this all works, the partnerships you've built, the connections you have in the community. Also sharing, what you've done during the pandemic to support physical, social, emotional, and academic needs. Any information you have on the types of students you've been serving. That'll be really important, as much of this funding is directed at students who've been most disproportionately impacted during the pandemic. We've had people record video messages, whether that's in a Zoom meeting or on social media. Just, they don't have to be very formal, but ways to deliver the messages to decision makers. And we are also just reminding decision makers that schools cannot do this alone, especially with one-time funding and staffing concerns as is. Community partners have been and will continue to be essential partners as we go forward. We've had some good conversations about creative uses and how folks are identifying key needs in their communities. Again, not just remediation, needs to think about social emotional learning and physical needs. We're talking about re-engaging and rebuilding relationships, starting there. And then providing rich and youth-centered activities and enrichment to boost attendance, right? If school districts spend this funding on adding more time to the day or to the year in doing the same activities, we're not so sure they're going to get different results. So we are really encouraging programs to think creatively and put youth at the center of what types of activities and people can they connect with this summer and going on through the school year to keep them engaged and to help them prepare. The one other thing I wanted to share was that some providers are going to LEAs with a menu of services and asking them, what do you need? Here's how we can make this fit to suit your needs. Other providers are collaborating locally or regionally to propose citywide uses of this funding for like a big summer program, something like that. And we are encouraging folks to just start wherever they have relationships, whether it's an assistant principal or a school counselor or PTA member, folks that you have established relationships with that can be another voice at the table with you to understand how you can leverage this funding, what you need, and how you can help students and families recover. Once you start there, just keep asking for the next level up. And just encouraging you all to, these conversations are difficult and happening fast, but hopefully, we have time to get everybody at the table right now. And then before wrapping up, I just wanted to present some of the other priorities that the CA3 Alliance is working on. CA3 and advocates like you are educating and informing decision makers in the Capitol and locally in their community and letting them know all that you've been doing throughout this pandemic, how your expertise and your relationships, your passion and your bravery have been so critical and will continue to be critical in the recovery. And for those reasons, we are asking for increased and protected funding in state budget. And we have a range of asks for, to support and improve service at existing programs, expand access to serve more students, provide a cost of living adjustment so that the staff who've been, especially those who've been working on campus, even while schools have been closed without vaccines and without full health benefits, have we can get them closer to a living wage. We also want to make sure that they have professional development opportunities and career pathways that will be critical now and for the future. We're also working on a bill with Assemblymember Carrillo's office, AB 1112, and that is to set up a data and stakeholder driven process to set the funding levels for the publicly funded streams, the ACES and 21st Century programs, to ensure that these programs can continuously adapt to meet student, family, and workforce needs. And lastly, want to just let you know that with CA3, we have a number of ways in which you can support policy efforts, whether it's local, regional site visits, texting platforms, social media, postcards, anything like that. So we're trying to empower you all in your local advocacy and also help bring the collective voice together for the benefit of the state. And then I just have my contact information here, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. There's so much content. I think we have time, for questions before we go in the breakout rooms. Does anyone want to come off mute or put a question in the chat to ask Jen? Because otherwise, I have a question for everyone else. So speak now or let me take the time.
I want to ask just a little bit if you could give us some more examples of other places where you've seen people working together and going to their school districts and getting funding. Like what any tips on how to do that successfully?
Yeah, we are very excited to have a good case example. At this point, we are just hearing about ways people are putting it up, and we haven't heard any official announcements yet. We've heard about a lot of conversation about older youth and ways in which that this funding can be leveraged, whether it's through peer mentoring or hiring older youth to help with summer programming, and giving them kind of like paid work opportunities as a way to get in. That was a creative use that has been coming up. We've also heard about conversations with community schools models, making sure that the funding that's also available for community schools can be braided to leverage this funding. I think a lot of the conversations that we're hearing start with the social and emotional needs of students. And we're hearing that community partners are really trying to raise that up and push back a little bit on the conversation, on the language of learning loss recovery and remediation, just to help explain the needs in the community. And so talking about, well, how about just having some student and family nights to help bring families back to school campus and help them readjust and get them comfortable with new procedures and processes, and starting from that relationship comfort and social and emotional well-being. And I would just say that PCY is anxious to put out some some case studies and examples for other people to use, because especially as we've seen with other funding streams like LCFF, it's been really helpful to say, oh, this school district's doing this. I know that's okay. We could do that here and we could do it different. You know, there's a little bit of competition and support from other communities throughout the state.
So we have some great questions here. For AB 86, do you know if CBOs need to be written into the district's plans before June 1st or by June 1st?
No, that is something we're still trying to get clarification on as well. We know that plans have to be in, but we've heard some conversation about how they can be updated and amended based on needs. So it shouldn't lock in funding. But if anybody has concerns about that, or if they're hearing that, to please, raise that up. Especially with the CDE's expanded learning division, they're helping kind of track what they're hearing on the ground and the questions that are coming from communities, especially as they're partnering with LEAs to figure out this funding.
Okay, and then is there funding directly targeted towards Title I schools? Or, and is there a difference between funding sources for Title I versus non-Title I schools if a non-Title I school still has a significant number of low-income families? We have a lot of borderline cases in our county.
Yes, we've had a number of questions and concern about this as well. We haven't heard how, well, we are looking for guidance from the state on how they'd like to see this done. In some cases, we've seen LEAs that receive Title I funding group programs that are available for the full district at a certain site. So even if not every site can have a program because they aren't Title I or for whatever reason, we have seen that case where districts can pull the resources and have a few sites so that it can be inclusive of students and families, even at schools that are not Title I. But very excited also to, get some examples on that as well.
And I will just follow up on the question about if CBOs need to be in the district's plans by June 1st. Are people on the call in active communication with the districts right now? If anyone, or the Zoom, if you guys want to put that in chat, or thumbs up, thumbs down on your emojis, how many people are in active communication with the districts right now? Because I know that was part of our conversation at our last gathering. And Jen, you were making reference to being part of the planning. Do you have any best practices besides sending baskets of muffins that you've seen work for nonprofits and out-of-school providers?
Yes, we've been hearing that conversations, outside of the school board meeting, directly with folks at the district office have been helpful to sit down, bring the menu of options you could provide, or coming up with a short proposal. And proposal could just be 1 or 2 pages, just listing, here's what you could do, here are the students you could impact, resources that you can leverage. So if you have funding from other places that you can braid with this, has been really encouraging. And we have some examples during the pandemic that we've been sharing about creative uses of school and community partnerships, whether that's the community learning hubs or the fact that, so many of the after school and summer program space really pivoted and created new ways of reaching kids and families. And so giving examples from that and building upon them have been really helpful. And also identifying maybe there are some things that were changed during the pandemic that should remain the same going forward. And we've heard, some people may still have use for some support via distance, like remotely. But also, talking about like the ratios and the students that you were able to serve during this time. Those have been the recommendations that I've gathered so far on how to approach that one-on-one conversation, or with a group of partners, which is also, we've heard that LEAs are open to that as well.
Okay, I'm not seeing other questions in the chat. I would say you touched on the ratio reduction that's occurred in our field. Are you seeing statewide a lot of providers wanting to keep their ratios lower as more and more people get vaccinated? And I know schools aren't back to full capacity, but I was wondering if you had a hunch on what providers are going to choose to do there.
We have been having some conversations with the Department of Education about the flexibility, the temporary flexibility for programs, to have smaller ratios and blend staffing and services in new ways, to see if that can be extended to the next school year. Understanding that not all schools are at the same place right now. We, with the governor's messaging about, schools should be fully back in the fall, we're unclear how much support there is for that, and feel that, ratios have been so important to support students during this time, the lowering of the ratios. And we are encouraging more conversation to keep ratios, especially talking about the different ages of students, thinking about programs, especially for younger students, how can you really go back to 20-1 for kindergartners? So lots of questions about that. And we're, the other piece, that the bill that I mentioned with Assemblymember Carole, that's a lot of the conversation we're having there as well about, how could this public funding be better leveraged to provide quality programming? And that could include, lowering the ratios or providing different funding based on the ages of students and locations. So yes, but not there yet.
Eleanor, I know you had a question. You want to go ahead?
Thanks. Thank you so much, Jen. Great presentation. I'm sorry I had to come in a little bit late. I got stuck on another call and I missed the first beginning. Nonetheless, so forgive me if this question isn't appropriate, okay? So I was thinking that, we have a summer camp online program for children, right? And so many schools outside of California have been interested in it, right? So what I'm trying to do is get the California schools more interested in it. Now, I know that kids want to be outside for summer camp, right? We know that, it's California after all. But you see, this is an actual health curriculum. Is this something that you think would be appropriate for schools to take a look at and be provided for in this way? Of course, we have a fall program too, and we have a full curriculum for health, wellness, and safety with things like that. But most important is the summer camp. So that's where I'm coming from. What do you think? I just want your opinion here.
In my opinion, we have been hearing about programs setting up, or interested in setting up kind of intensive or focused camps. I don't recall any requirements about funding, whether it's in person or virtual, for these different streams. Obviously the in-person grants from the state need to be used for that such. But yeah, I think it is something that you could propose with this funding. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you, Jen. It's very helpful. I know my question was a little out of the left field here, but thank you. Good.
Wrap this up. Jen, I'm just wondering if you've noticed any shifts over this last year due to COVID between school district and providers relationships.
That is a wonderful question. We, at Partnership for Children and Youth, were part of a survey with the California Afterschool Network and CDE to existing ACES and 21st grantees, just trying to get a base mark of what are you planning, how hard has it been, what does it look like. But one of the questions was about your relationship and partnership with school districts, and I think there was a mix. In some cases, they had a relationship and a partnership worked out, and this just strengthened it in a whole new way. And I mean, I heard the superintendent for Sacramento City Unified say last week that CBOs, their community partners were the only way that they could provide in-person support. They were critical. And I had never heard a superintendent, speak so highly and understand and recognize the efforts of community partners who have been doing this. But in other cases, it's still been a hard road to get to the table in some LEAs. And I think perhaps with the larger LEAs, we've heard more of maybe the community partners coming together to approach the LEA. But that is something that also decision makers at the state level are also asking about, and something we are continuing to talk about as we are advocating for funding to go directly to, at least a portion of the funding to go directly to nonprofits, just because in some cases it has been so difficult.
Thank you. I think we'd all like to hear from that superintendent in Sacramento. How wonderful.
I think that's it. Jen, thank you so much for the information. I'm sure so many people will be emailing you, so we really appreciate you coming on down. Big San Mateo County, thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Heather for the next section of our gathering.
Great, thanks, Evan. Thanks, Jen. I think we all learned a bunch today, and I know I'm looking forward to clicking on a few links in those slides as well. So we are going to move into the breakout room section of our meeting today, and we've got a handful of questions that we can all ask and discuss. And the questions are, what do we need funds for? What are some of the creative ways that we can ask together for funding? What do we need from our partners? Are there any opportunities presented we should collaborate on? And how does this funding help sustain deeper partnerships? And we'll put those questions in the chat, so you can all refer to them. And we are all being asked to join breakout rooms, and then we will come back together and debrief.